How's everybody doing? Good. That was weak, but I'll take it.
It's because we haven't had enough sugar or calories.
You haven't had enough sugar? I don't know where you've been. So I'm going to be talking about DEP, Apple School Manager, and Jamf Pro primarily as far as our workflow goes, because those are the technologies that I'm using. So first, how many people are already enrolled in using DEP here? That's cool. That's a lot of people. I know there's been a lot of DEP and MDM talks, and there's been a lot of content related to that, especially considering some of the new stuff that has come out with WWDC, but I'm not going to concentrate on any of that because this is what I did to make things work now. And that's kind of important, especially in education where a lot of us are almost perpetually one version behind when we're doing deployments because we have to do it before classes start. And then the new version comes out right after classes start. So we haven't had time to test everything quite yet. But as I said, we're doing it a little late. This is kind of stuff that we knew we were supposed to be doing, and it's taken a while to get there. So if anyone's wondering who I am, that's a picture of me. You can see it's bigger than the actual me. My name is Adam Wickert. I work at Hamilton College, which is in Clinton, New York. I also live in a town called Hamilton, New York, that is unrelated and about a half hour away. I'm a desktop system administrator there, and I primarily deal with Macs and with computer labs, and most specifically, department-owned computer labs, which means there's a lot of unique special software setups in each one. I recently took the Jamf 200, so I'm a Jamf certified tech now. That's what it says, so I put it in my email signature. And this is my third time presenting here. Every time I come, I feel like I've learned so much that I shouldn't have presented the last time because I've learned so much new stuff that I'm like, that was wrong. It's not even that it's wrong, it's that there's better stuff. So sometimes you feel like, oh, I should have said that. But anyway, my school that I work at is, it's a small liberal arts college, and we're about 50-50 Mac and Windows across campus. So as far as our Mac workflow goes, 3 years ago when I started, we were using Deploy Studio for everything, which was basically gold master stuff. At the time, it was still okay, but it was not what everybody was doing. 2 years ago, we moved to Jamf Imaging and we did package-based deployment, which worked pretty well, but we were still erasing the drive, going through NetBoot, going through to push down all the packages, and then you had to wait for reboots and all that stuff, which is fine when you're doing a lab, and it's fine if you're the one preparing all the machines in front of you before you hand it to someone, which is still more or less what we do. So now we're doing a DEP imaging, except it's not imaging. Is it preparing or configuring or provisioning? And I think provisioning is what most people have landed on. So as much as I've written all of those words and all my documentation internally, I think provisioning is the one that we should probably continue with. And we have had Jamf Pro set up for a while. In fact, they had it before I started. It was primarily set up for printers. So there are a ton of printers across campus, which if you're on a school, you probably know different buildings and different departments all have printers. And the thing that they did was spend a lot of time to put them in self-service, which is great, except now when I go to put things in self-service, there are 100 printers to go through before you can hit anything else. So I've got some work to do when it comes to scoping things now that I'm working on a little bit more of the capabilities that Jamf offers us. But because we had switched to Jamf imaging, we had package-based workflows that I could reference, and I could say, okay, for this lab, I created this workflow, which included all of these pieces of software, and then I can compare them to what I was doing with DEP. But first, before we go into the whole what DEP is going to do for us, I want to tell a story about what happened last year. We were setting up Jamf Imaging, like I said, to basically erase and put a flat image and then packages on top of it, which worked great for all the new machines at the time. We have machines that were getting repurposed, so they were getting erased and reinstalled with a newer OS. When you try to do that with High Sierra, with APFS, if it hadn't had a firmware update, the machine would fail to boot. It would look like the image was applied correctly. And when it rebooted, it would just give you a folder with a question mark. So initially, this just happened to a dozen computers, and it took a while to figure it out. And we're like, okay, well, we'll just try erasing it and trying it again. And when you do an erase and just install the package and then do it again, it kind of works. We looked at a couple of different solutions for that, including there was a blog post that explained, well, you could try to extract the firmware update, run the firmware update first, and then you could continue running your netboot Jamf imaging workflow. It was sort of functional. It seemed to fail a lot, and it's probably because it wasn't designed to work that way from Apple. And as we kind of had to keep doing that, we're doing twice the work on every machine because we have to sit in front of it and manually run it at the time, because once it's erased, I can't use Jamf to push anything out, like push out a 10.13.6 installer and do StartOS install, even though they wouldn't support erase install yet. But it worked pretty well until this point. So everyone's talking about DEP and MDM, and with some of the new stuff coming out in Catalina, like supervised mode and the Kerberos extension and changes to how kernel extensions work. There's a lot of stuff to talk about when it comes to DEP and why we're going to need it. So Apple's device enrollment, as you can see, it automatically assigns machines to MDM during the setup assistant, presuming, of course, you're connected to the internet. If you're not connected to the internet, it'll do it the first time you do connect to the internet. Your MDM takes over and installs the required profiles for your MDM, and then other installs. So in the case of Jamf, it pushes out like the Jamf binary. And using DEP, you're able to automatically approve the user-approved MDM and user-approved kernel extension loading items. And without it, you've got things like antivirus or printer software that now requires an additional click, or a user can opt to say no, and then it's not going to work. And then if you have someone at the help desk who isn't aware of this workflow because it's different and new, they might say remove something and then re-add it, and now that's not going to work without knowing that they have to check that box, or it's going to keep popping up for them. And because of that short time limit that you get to click the OK box, or it's approve, I think. But when you miss that time period, you might still get a message from the application that you need to approve it. So you need to reboot and try to get it again. DEP allows you to configure machines regardless of the location and without having to physically touch them. And a lot of people call that zero touch, where you've got everything prepped and the machine gets shipped to whoever. And when they log in, everything happens automatically. So what is imaging? Imaging is dead. If you go to isimagingdead.com, they'll tell you. So what are the goals for imaging? We want to prepare a machine for a user. We want to have a standard with basic software management. We want to install all those required pieces of software that we use here, whether it's Microsoft Office, whether it's Adobe software, any of those pieces that everybody is going to be using. And we want to ensure that the devices are managed so that we can remotely support them, so that we can make sure that they have the ability to run pieces of software that we've already licensed and packaged for them, and to make sure that there's some additional security pieces that we might be able to cover that we can monitor and things like that. So the next question is, why can't we image? Well, there's the T2. They don't support net booting. They will support external boot in a fashion, but you have to go through the setup assistant. You have to then boot to recovery and turn on external boot, and you can't use target disk mode to image either. Firmware updates are another popular one, and that includes things like the APFS support. But there's other things now with the T2 and with the touch bar, and some other model-specific items are not necessarily included in the installer, but are pulled down during the install process. Because of that, you might run into other issues, and this was something that came out with the first touch bar with the T1, is you would try to restore using your Jamf imaging, and you would run through an issue of the touch bar has to do an update before you can log in. That was an issue, and now we have even more. And of course, security changes like the UAMDM and the UAKEL stuff and future controls that are only available to machines that are enrolled via DEP to get that supervised mode, which is going to be sort of the same as what they offer in iOS. So you can, if you really want. If you really want to, there are ways to image. There are some specific workflows that will work, and they did even cover this in WWDC. I'm sure some of you heard about that session that riled a bunch of people up that says, yes, you can because there's some new support, except only in really specific cases. In this case, it's a lot like I kind of described earlier. You have to already be on the same version of the OS. You have to have already the updated firmware, and you can push down an image that is exactly the same, and it will work. But why would you? If DEP is the way of the future, and you are already getting set up for DEP, why should you make two different workflows? At least in our case, and I know that not everybody's going to necessarily have this, we purchased everything directly from Apple since DEP has been available. And that actually meant that I could just go in and put our customer number in, and it pulled all of the stuff that we'd ever bought. It didn't automatically add it to our MDM, but since October 2013, I believe is the date, everything that we've bought is now available as something that we can import into DEP. So where do we go from here? We plug in all of these machines, which actually none of them are plugged in. They're all running over Wi-Fi, and they're running at various states of the DEP workflow that I've prepared, sitting on a bench in our storage room. So we're going to set up a DEP provisioning workflow, and that's what I've done. The first step was to figure out the current state of all the policies, profiles, packages, and groups that currently exist in Jamf. So then we need to sign up for Apple School Manager or Apple Business Manager, depending on where you are, of course. You need to get your customer number from Apple Orders. Obviously, there's a few more steps if you've purchased from a reseller that is DEP integrated, but essentially the same thing applies. It's just a little bit more work, and they have to do a little bit more on their back end in order to get it pre-populated. But I'm told that a lot of people have luck getting it to happen. We're going to connect Apple School Manager with our instance of Jamf Pro. We auto-assign to our Jamf Pro instance, and then we add all of our existing inventory in. So it sounds simple, or maybe it doesn't. But the first step is probably the most time-consuming, or it's even ongoing because it's all about managing what you currently have, all of the policies, all of the profiles, all of the packages, all of the groups, all of the departments, all of the users, things that you, or at least we, were not using yet. So we have, of course, policies and profiles and packages, but we weren't utilizing any groups really. For most things, we weren't utilizing departments, or we weren't utilizing buildings. So going through those things gave us a whole bunch of new ways to scope that more closely mirror how we scoped things in AD for the Windows machines, because we had things set by building and then by department. New inventory was added automatically. I thought I hit that button already. My bad. But because new inventory is added automatically to DEP as soon as you turn it on and you automatically set it to Jamf Pro, they'll run into your existing instance. So the first thing I had to do is sign up for Apple School Manager. And this was actually the hardest thing to find any documentation on, because I couldn't find anything, and my Apple SE didn't offer a whole lot of information when I asked him how we set it up. We had a separate VPP account, but we had never set up DEP before. So I poked around and finally found that there's a form that you can fill out, and just a whole bunch of information about where you're from. There's some information on like your contact information, but also like your supervisor's contact information. And this ended up being a lot easier than I thought. In a couple of days, it was maybe 3 or 4 days, my boss got a phone call and asked me to come in and tell him that, yes, I in fact signed up for DEP and that he was aware of what it was, but wanted to make sure that somebody wasn't just randomly calling about it. And once that happened, in about an hour, I got an email. I was able to log in. And then you have options for things like assigning devices. What I did, because they're all available, they basically all showed up, but they're not assigned to an instance. Once I linked it to Jamf Pro, I was able to take from our inventory, upload all of those serial numbers, and assign them in here, even though most of them were already manually enrolled. So when I set it up, it shows that I've got several hundred devices here. It breaks down which types are set up, and the automatic device assignment is configured, but there's a bunch of your information that you can edit through the settings, and you can set up more than one MDM if you have them. You just have a little bit more work to do when it comes to assigning. In our case, we use very little iOS management at this point, but we're looking into adding it more, and by automatically assigning them, now the first time they turn on, they log into, they get added into Jamf, and now we can make sure that they have things like a passcode, and although we had asked everyone to put those on, before we put them all in Jamf, we couldn't make sure that they were really doing it. So what I did is set up a pre-stage enrollment in Jamf. So we create a new workflow and add some profiles, and there are enrollment packages available, and you can skip some parts of the setup assistant when you do this. I have a few simple profiles, like some whitelists for the kernel extensions for things like Google, because Drive File Stream asks for some security. There's the Sophos, some of our printers, and those things just make everything faster, easier, and we don't have to deal with the help desk not realizing that you need to re-click that if you remove it and re-add it. The other thing you have to make sure is that when you scope a profile in a pre-stage enrollment, unless it continues to be scoped after it's finished, so if you do any organizing or changing, it won't stay. Enrollment packages is something that I think is still relatively new. It does require that your primary data source is a cloud repository, and I was also told by Jamf support not to use particularly large packages. When you do that, they said it doesn't handle it super well. So I decided that after looking through the features, I didn't really need any enrollment packages because it's pretty easy to trigger things upon enrollment complete. And probably 90% of the time it works exactly as I expect it to. After it's enrolled, or after you're enrolled rather, we're going to use Jamf inventory preload to set up users, locations, and departments for machines. We scope smart groups to automatically assign software and profiles based on the locations, the users, the departments. And we replace some of the things that we used to do to modify the default user template. I have been told that some people have successfully modified the default user template in Mojave. I have not had very much luck with that at all. So in an effort to avoid that, I used some tools like Outset, Desktopper, and DocuTill to give some basic settings to every user who logs in. But there's a lot of updating, cleaning, and the nice thing about this type of a setup is you can start cleaning up everything, and then it's only fixing the thing that needs to be updated. So instead of having to change all your workflows or build new ones when new things come out, you're now adding on to one smaller piece or just updating the one package. And yes, I realize it's similar to what some of the package-based workflows were doing before, but now it's a little bit less dependent on what OS you're running. So this is a probably very hard to read screenshot showing that there are a ton of things that you can use for inventory preload. This is a file that is available from Jamf that is the default template. And I believe if you just go to the inventory preload page, which is in settings on Jamf, you can just download this file. A fun thing that I found out is that you don't need to use all of those fields because there are a ton of them and they're not all necessarily relevant. There's 2 different barcode fields and an asset tag field, all of which could be useful depending on what you're doing. There's also a vendor field. For me, that's basically irrelevant. Everything we bought has been from Apple, so it's not important. So I found myself cutting it down, and when I export from our inventory, I only export the relevant data, which is basically the user, email, location, and then their department, along with our asset tag. And the asset tag is important for ours, as that's how we set like our computer name, so that when we're searching and organizing things, we know which machine is which. If I'm to be honest, this might be my favorite part, which sounds super nerdy, but I am a huge like organizational nerd, and I love, is anybody familiar with Plex? I know Damien is, but if anybody didn't see, he did a presentation on Plex. But personally at home, one of my favorite things to do is take every DVD and Blu-ray that I own and encode it, and then edit the metadata and put it back into Plex, and then edit it again because Plex doesn't always pull it the way I want it to, which is just like what I have to do here. Everything doesn't always pull the way that I want it to. And some of the things that I found out is we use some users that are generic users for labs, which are great. They are really helpful that I can search for lab users and assign software to computers that are assigned to lab users. The problem is, every time you upload something into inventory preload and a machine logs in, it pulls from there, which is great, but only the last entry for a user will update the user information. So we had some location or some lab users that had an email address that was associated to someone specific for that lab, which I thought would be great. And then it would change for everyone, or the default department for that user would change. Wasn't horrible, but it did mean I had to go through and edit and realize what some of those things were doing, because I thought that the documentation was a little bit difficult to parse. But once you've kind of gone through and massaged that data and made it to what you think it should, you then get some pretty cool visibility into what the machines are. So I have an asset tag, which is the thing that I need to sort by more often than anything else. The username, the full name, and the location, and the department, and all those really cool things, which let me scope everything. And it also lets me look through and see if I'm repurposing a machine, what the previous setting was. Because even if you update your information in the record, if you have an inventory preload setting for a machine for a previous user, when it goes through DEP, it's going to reassign that. So I just had to make sure that if we reutilized a machine, we re-uploaded that information as part of inventory preload. So we have to automate it and kick it off, because I want to do as little sitting in front of a computer as I have to. So I wrote some API scripts that automate things to set the computer name using our inventory barcode. It sets a firmware password. It sets the local admin based on the owner of the computer. And I've got those on GitHub. I put a link already in the notes if anyone was looking in there, but I've also got it at the end of this. A really important part of this was DEP Notify. I know there have been some sessions, specifically yesterday there was a session on DEP Notify. And it's not the only way that you can show what's going on to your user. And even in this case, a lot of our machines are still being deployed by folks on our team. But by knowing where it is in the deployment process, it makes my job a lot easier. And when it comes to a lab, I can set it to automatically log out. So I walk up, set that first user, it logs in, does DEP Notify, and then logs out, and the lab is ready. So it's one touch instead of having to go back and make sure that everything is working. So it's a little bit closer to that old style where I walked around and I hit N, and then I waited, and then I hit N, and then I waited, and then I hit N, and then I waited. So instead I just hit power, and then I wait, and I run around. There's a script called DEP Notify Starter, and that's actually from Jamf, which I have used as my base to organize and kick off everything. And a lot of it is, again, based on smart groups, which I'm using buildings and departments, because we have some departments that are in multiple buildings, and we have some buildings housing lots of departments. So I've tried to scope as many things as I can to either specific labs or specific departments to make it so that we're touching things as little as we have to by automatically adding things like their printers or automatically adding software that I know is being used in this department. So this is just a quick screenshot of what the DEP Notify starter looks like, and this is probably the most important piece. It is an array that runs the policies and the text that display while the DEP Notify project is running. I've set some basically custom triggers for each one, and they're all only triggered by that custom trigger, but they're also scoped for DEP enrolled machines, and they're scoped for the departments that are appropriate. So we've got some that say installing department software, and some that say installing academic or installing custom lab software. And those things will skip basically if they're not in scope, but it makes it easier so that I have one thing that I update and then we push through it. So I have what I think is a pretty good looking thing now when you sit down, and it kind of looks like this. I've got the fancy looking logo from our official style guide, and then kind of goes through and takes way longer than this, but it just tells you everything that is going through and everything that's installing, and I think it works pretty well. This whole process, initially when you log in, just like anything else with DEP, it will start pulling things down on Enrollment Complete. The problem is Enrollment Complete doesn't always happen the very second that you have finished logging in. Sometimes it does take a couple of minutes, and sometimes it not only takes a couple of minutes, but then it has to check in, it has to download the software, and it might be slower than you have expected. It probably takes, in most machines, in the vicinity of 15 to 20 minutes in total, but the first couple of minutes sometimes are longer than others. So this is a list of the tools that I have used, and we kind of went over what a lot of them do, but just to get a little bit more information, DEP Notify is actually surprisingly powerful, and it can even be triggered more automatically just by the logs in Jamf if you scope things a little bit differently than I did. The DEP Notify starter script was really helpful when I found myself going through and trying to find a way to easily kick off everything that I wanted to install. And we're using Outset, which, is anyone familiar with Outset already? Outset basically runs a couple of different ways, but you can run at something at login, you can run it once at login, you can run things at boot, and you can run them privileged that way as well. So they run as root. What we do is we have things run as the user, and we have scripts that do things like they use Desktopper, which is a super simple little script that will set a desktop background, which doesn't pop up any of those warnings that Mojave gets that says this application wants to control this. By being able to set that, because we've been asked to, then they set it to a blank color instead of that nice Mojave picture that comes in, or whatever OS it is. I'm also using Docutil, which is not the only tool, but there are multiple tools that will let you customize and edit your doc. You can set it to run every time. I have it set it to run once. It clears the doc, and it just puts some of our basic apps on there. I use white box packages for a lot of things. If anyone was in the session in the other room just now, in Dean's Hall 1, there was an awful lot of information from Rich about packaging and scripting and packaging, and a lot of that stuff is super important, especially as I move into more individualized pieces instead of large groups of software. So I also found myself utilizing Profile Creator, which was a relatively new addition because I hadn't really been using profiles before. So, any questions? We've got the catch box up here. going to try. Worked.
As far as using smart groups, can you do the same types of things with static groups?
You can, but since I was utilizing the inventory preload, what I did was make them all based on the uploaded information. So I have fewer times that I have to step and touch and manually add a group. So instead I say, okay, well, chemistry gets chem lab or whatever software. Want to send the catch box back over that direction?
Do you see any benefit in using the inventory preload over something like JSS MUT, the mass update tool? You talked about having to re-upload your inventory every time that something was repurposed.
You can upload individual machines, which I know the MUT can do. The difference is that I don't know if anyone's familiar. Has everyone heard of the MUT? I think it's supposed to stand for like the mass update tool.
That's great. JSS MUT, it's a mass update tool. It lets you upload basically a spreadsheet of data into your JSS, whether it be asset numbers or computer names or assignment.
There are a couple of differences. If you do that, it does update the existing record. Inventory preload can both do it if the machine hasn't checked in ever and there is no record for it. And if the machine is erased, it will reuse this information, which even if you completely delete the record from Jamf, it will still have this information in there. You can upload just one at a time. You can upload the whole group. I've been doing it by departments as I do it just for organizational purposes. But the MUT's a great tool. I found myself needing to do some other things that I ended up writing some API scripts for, like importing all of our departments and buildings, because if you use inventory preload, the building and departments all have to already exist or you will get errors. You also have to be really careful about the way dates are ordered. So if you do a date for the purchase date, it has to be in the right format. And I think that the MUT actually requires you to do mostly the same things. Like, it's just, I don't think you can cycle through and create departments or buildings.
All right, thank you.
Anybody else? I've got some links here from my GitHub. I'm actually going to see if I'll pull up those some of those scripts if anybody wants to see what I'm doing with the API scripts. Of course, I have to switch my display mode here. Of course. Is that readable up there? Probably not. So, and I have all these up in my GitHub, but I have a couple of different scripts. And basically, what I used as the default in Jamf is that the first three variables in a script are already defined. And off the top of my head, I don't remember. One of them is computer and one of them is the user. But as a result, 4, 5, and 6 are the remaining ones. So, or the first remaining ones, I guess. So what I have is I've set the API user and API password and the JSS host name as those variables, and you can actually modify that in Jamf admin or through the JSS. But they're just really simple. This just grabs the serial number and it pulls through the serial number for the username that it's assigned to, and then it creates that as, or adds that to the admin group. So if you put it in, there are a couple of ways. Some people, I'm sure, will probably talk about the security of passing through your username and password. I know that Jamf has a salting script that you can use that lets you modify your information so it's not sent in plain text. I personally, and if anyone was in the API semi-workshop this morning, I do sort of the same thing where I have users that only have really specific permissions that can only do the thing that I'm trying to do. So in this case, all I can do is pull up the information from a record. I have a similar one here to create a firmware password. And then the only thing that this does is this actually has to switch to the expect from bash, because you have to interact with the prompt, otherwise it won't actually set. I don't know if anybody has a better way to do this, but since this works pretty well, that's what we've been doing. And I have one that does the same thing for renaming, and it pulls the asset tag that we've set, and that lets us name our computer based on the asset tag that we use, which is just handy for our organizational purposes. But we actually set the computer name, host name, and local host name separately, and then we have a policy that checks whether their computer name is in what we call our standard, and once a day it runs, and if somebody's tried to change it, it changes it back for, again, it's just reporting purposes. It's probably not super necessary, but it was someone else's idea before, and I just made it stay. This is to add a user to an admin group just manually, which I found is really helpful with a lab. If you have somebody who works as like the lab manager, and all you have to do is pass the username. That prevents me from having 90 different scripts to add a user, or only doing things with Jamf Remote, but being able to create a policy that, again, is scoped by the building and room number, so that we know that all the things in this building, in this room, that are part of that lab are assigned to that person, and that person is set as the admin, because like a lot of the labs, like I said, are using shared users. The group admin is a similar thing, and our default login is called Hamilton D, but obviously you can replace that with whatever your AD setup is. But if you add that group, you can make a group and admin, which is useful in department labs where there are multiple users that are within one department that you can set. And again, it's all about trying to make things simpler, using those fields to pass things through. This is something I actually didn't write, and there's a link right to the top from Jamf Nation, but and this is what I was talking about with the MUT, is I wasn't able to find a really good way to try to create all the departments and buildings. So I created this file with the CSV that you pass the CSV through it and write in. This application I'm using is Code Runner. It lets me just run it right from there, so I'm running it from my desktop instead of running it through anything else, and that lets me just kind of hard code in the username and password when I'm actually using it. So that's more or less what I was working on. So let me put this back up here. Any more questions? I was expecting a little more interaction. I'm sorry. I didn't time it super well, I guess. We've got a lot of time.
When you went through your list of utilities you used, you skipped over Desktopper.
Oh, Desktopper is a little application, and previously, in order to set a desktop background, it was popular to use OSA script, which in Mojave, if you use that to try to change a file, it pops up and asks you for permission. So even if it was running in the background, the first thing that one of the users would see is terminal wants to use this. And in order to avoid that, I found that somebody else had the same problem and already created a very little utility that we just push out. And I did have links in all my other, of all the other tools so that people have some information, of course. I've done a lot of documenting this for everybody that I work with, so that I've been sharing a lot of the same information out. So of course, if I missed anything or didn't cover anything, I'm glad to I'm glad to share it again or go through it, but this is what I've been living and breathing for 6 months, to try to switch everything from what seemed like a really good tool to another set of really good tools, because we don't have the same, I don't know, we don't have the same groups of availability that we used to. Anybody else want the catch box? All right, well, I guess we'll call that.
Thank you.
Thank you.